Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this new Severalnines webinar on our latest release of ClusterControl 1.2.11. I'm joined today by my colleague Art van Scheppingen, who will walk us through the latest features of ClusterControl and also, for the most part of this webinar, do a live demo of this new version. And we look forward to showing you these new features and having a bit of a discussion with you at the end about what we're demonstrating. So on the next slide, it's just to confirm that we are recording this session, and we will be making the replay and the slides available to you soon, probably in a couple of days after the webinar. You can ask us any questions throughout the next hour by using the question section of your control panel or the chat box as well. And if you have any further questions afterwards, feel free to email us at info@severalnines.com, and we'll be happy to respond to you there. Before we get started with the actual presentation, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of ClusterControl and where the product came from. It's really the result of our thinking around what the infrastructure lifecycle of databases is. Most of us at Severalnines have a MySQL background in that we all worked for MySQL, and already back in that time we were looking at how can we help the users, MySQL users, run and manage their databases more efficiently, from a deployment, through monitoring, through to management perspective. And this was mostly on the MySQL cluster side of things, NDB, which we will talk about just a little bit. But on the next slides, I just want to walk through how we then came to produce and develop ClusterControl. So the thinking here was that when it comes to running databases, the total cost of ownership of those is usually thought of being the price of the software and probably the hardware as well. But in reality, most of the cost comes from actually running these systems, both from a human resources perspective, as well as from training, potential downtime of the databases that happen quite a bit, depending on how they've been set up to begin with. So all of these things generate additional cost and make it more difficult maybe to run these databases. And this is where we came from for ClusterControl, to look at automating a lot of these tasks and a lot of these activities that need to be happening around running a database system. So next we're going to look at what this means exactly and how we look at the infrastructure lifecycle of a database. So like I mentioned, for us there are 4 elements to this. It's the deployment side. So once you deploy a database, what you do next, you start monitoring to see how the system is behaving, whether it's doing what it should be doing, and whether it's performing the right way. Then there's a whole range of management tasks that need to happen as well, which are typically done by a database administrator. And then as the business grows and the data sets grow, you need to be able to scale your systems up or down as the case may be. And so those are the 4 areas we look at when we talk about infrastructure lifecycle of databases. Next, then, what we also looked at is beyond the monitoring, because most people who run databases use some kind of monitoring tool, but we try to look beyond that with ClusterControl and look at how much of the management of a database can be automated. So that starts at provisioning, but also looking at configuration or availability management, scaling, as I mentioned before, how to maybe automate patches and upgrades. So these are the things we look at when we talk about management. And scaling in particular, which is the next slide, is a big one, because that's typically very manual to do, and it's a bit of a handy job, so to speak. And this is one of the big areas we looked at automating and making sure that by a click of a mouse you can scale up and down your database clusters. And all of this thinking brought us to ClusterControl, which I'm going to look at next, and just look at some of the main features and the main aspects of it. So on the next slide, you find those 4 elements again. We start with the deployment and the monitoring, which you see at the bottom of the slide. And those are feature elements that are available as part of our community edition of ClusterControl, and you can use them for free and forever in inverted commas. So that's the community version for it. And then there's a commercial version in which we include all of the management and scaling features. Those can be tested for 2 weeks once you install the community version. So you have access to management and scaling for 2 weeks. And then it reverts back to the community edition. If you want to continue then using management and scaling, you can of course upgrade your community edition to a pro or enterprise edition and benefit from those features there. Just very briefly, a bit more detail on those four elements on the next slides. So I mentioned provisioning, and in fact, ClusterControl enables you to deploy a cluster within minutes, and we'll see that shortly in the demo, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. There's a whole range of different monitoring features and elements that come with it as well, whether it's 1 sec resolution or real time. The monitoring is real time and historical as well. So you can see the different elements here that are part of the monitoring features. And next we'll look briefly at the management features, which include most of the things I mentioned earlier. Of course, the one-click scaling. You can organize and automate your database upgrades. Repair recovery is a big feature. Configuration management backups. You can schedule your backups as well and automate those processes. So this is really all we look at in terms of automation and management. And next, I just want to talk about which database systems we support with ClusterControl. So on the left-hand side, you can see all of the different SQL systems we support. So these are all of the different MySQL flavors, for example, including replication and standalone for MySQL and MariaDB. And of course, we support the Percona server as well. And there's Postgres there too, which we support since a few months. And in fact, this version 1.311 we're talking about today is a big enhancement project for Postgres users. So we'll hear about that in a few minutes. And on the right-hand side, we have MongoDB and TokuMX by Percona, which is now morphing into the Percona server for MongoDB, which you might have heard of already. And I think with that, we're pretty much almost set to get started with the presentation itself on 1.211. Just to show you on the next slide the various types of users that we have. So we have over 8,000 community users at present, and a couple hundred customers, some of which you can see here, whether it's in the telecommunications area, or in publishing, or in government. There's a great mix there of customers, and hopefully you'll be joining that list soon. And with that said, that's everything for me for now, and I'll hand over to Art for the presentation on 1.311.
Thank you very much, Jean-Jérôme. Good morning, good afternoon. Today I have a short agenda where I'm going to present you all the new features in ClusterControl and enhancements. Tell a little bit of background on what we implemented there. Then we'll have a demo for about half an hour. And in the meanwhile, you can ask your questions and answers, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. So what new features do we have in ClusterControl 1.2.11? Well, the most important addition, like Jean-Jérôme said already, is creating the Postgres replication setups. In ClusterControl 1.2.9, we added support for standalone Postgres servers, but now in 1.2.11, we added support for the replication setups, which allows you to create multi-node clusters. We also improved the cluster overview of Postgres and added many of the features that you know from the MySQL cluster overview to the Postgres overview. We did a similar thing with MySQL replication. Up until this version, we supported adding MySQL replicated setups into ClusterControl. Now we have actually the capability of adding MySQL replicated setups by creating first a master and then a slave. Within the cluster overview, just like with Postgres, you can see all the exact same features as you are used to in the Galera cluster overview in ClusterControl. And then another important addition to ClusterControl is that in addition to HA proxy, we can now deploy MariaDB MaxScale proxy to your MySQL clusters. MaxScale is an intelligent proxy that you can do a little bit more than just balance your connections or queries over multiple hosts, like you're used to with HA proxy or a similar load balancer. One of its key features is that it is actually capable of analyzing the queries that you send to MaxScale. So it has the capability of analyzing whether it's a read or write operation on your database, and then it decides runtime on that whether it's going to perform this read or write query on a master or a slave, or in the case of Galera, on one single host. The added benefit is that in the case of Galera, the write operations will only be done and performed on one single host, and that will resolve the issue of optimistic locking, and it will also lower the chance of rollbacks and deadlocks. As you can see in this overview, it's quite simple. On the right-hand side, you can see ClusterControl, which basically then takes care of the provisioning of MySQL MariaDB replication and puts MaxScale in front of it. And then your application stack on top of that can make use of MaxScale. Also, a new feature in ClusterControl is the system logs, and the system logs are basically all the log files from either MySQL or MongoDB. So for MySQL, we added the error log, the InnoDB, backup log, and the prepare logs. And for MongoDB, we added the MongoDump backup log and the system log. And now you can just immediately go from the overview of the cluster into the system logs of the cluster. So you don't have to log into your hosts anymore to actually read what is going wrong. You can immediately also correlate whatever you see in the user interface, what's happening behind the scenes in the database, for instance. Some fixes and improvements. We improved the MySQL configuration management. In the previous versions, the configuration management consisted out of several tabs, host and template sections, and those kind of work together. We now combined those tabs, host, and template sections into a single page. That actually makes sense. And now you can also easily modify your configuration. So you can go to a host, edit the configuration file, save the configuration file, and then on the next restart of, for instance, MySQL, the new configuration parameters will be reloaded. So you can do configuration management within ClusterControl. We also improved the MySQL user management in a similar way. The user management interface also consisted out of several tabs and dialogues that allow you to create users or grant and modify the users. In the new interface, it's all on one page, so you can immediately create an account and do the grants at the same time, and the same goes for the user overview. If you click on a user, you can immediately change all the grants for this single user. So it's a lot more practical than the old interface. That's what I had in mind for highlighting the new features and improved features of ClusterControl 1.2.11. And I will continue with demoing ClusterControl 1.2.11.